So very much welcome all of you to the local session on this EuroScience Policy Forum on the responsible internationalization, the academic collaboration dilemma. And my name is Annika Stensson-Trygell, and I am a professor and also vice president for research at KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden, and I'm the moderator for this session today. And we have three invited panelists. So we have Stefan Swartling Pettersson, and he is a public health physician and also professor of global transformation for health at Karolinska Institute in Sweden. And he's also affiliated to Makerere University in Uganda. And he is also the immediate past global chief for health for UNICEF. So very much welcome. We also have Stefan Östlund, and he's a professor and vice president for global relations at KTH, Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden. And he has a wide experience of different roles in university leadership, such as head of the School for Electrical Engineering, vice dean for education, director for the KTH Railway Group, and also is on the board of the KIC Energy. So he has been working with the development and implementation of guidelines for responsible internationalization, and also working with this in different roles in the leadership. And we also have Tommy C, that also is invited as one of my panelists. And Tommy, he is associate professor in business administration at the Lund University in Sweden. And he is also the science policy director at STINT, the Swedish Foundation for International Cooperation, Research and Higher Education. And his research and teaching focus on globalization for research and geopolitics, and also responsible internationalization of research and business networks and innovation. And he has experience in the policy field about the analysis of geopolitical developments in global knowledge production, also advisor on China's growing global importance, and also implementation of guidelines for responsible internationalization. So it's a lot of questions related to that. So I'm very happy that you all three are here. And then what is this all about? Well, what it is that we have a lot of increased importance of international collaboration all around the world. And there are several dilemmas that are related to that, both for individual researchers, since the internationalization is very important for their academic career, and also the possibility to get research funding. And it's also very important for the academic institutions for the reputation and ranking. But therefore, it's important for it adds value, and it increase the quality, both for research and education, since you're working together with a really skilled people all around the world. And also you increase the likelihood for that the research results will be implemented and thereby impacting society all around our planet. At the same time, there are some difficult challenges related to this. Examples are, for example, when you're collaborating with countries that are not governed democratically, it could be countries with a history of corruption, it could be human rights violations, countries with rapidly developing research systems, and countries with other ethical considerations of the research. And joint research could be a way to then catalyze changes in these countries, but at the same time, potential risks and difficulties can come up, and they need to be assessed and weighted against the opportunities that it will give. So this session focuses on the question how the researchers and the academic institutions can relate to these type of dilemmas, the pros and cons of the collaboration, how to handle that. So we will start with a brief summary standpoint from each of the panelists. And I suggest that Stefan Swartling Pettersson, if you would like to start.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be in this talk today. But first, I wanted to quarrel with your title and introduction a little bit, because a dilemma implies that there is no solution. There's only lose-lose. And I think that's a very strict interpretation of this. I look at the Economist Democracy Index, which was published a month or two ago. And then I see that the number of full democracies in the world, if we take that as a measure, they are the Nordic countries, Canada, and New Zealand. And that allows us to work with maybe generously 100 million people out of 7.7 billion in the world. So obviously that's not a way to go. I think it is about taking risks, following, because it's also about different value systems. We have our values, but the whole idea of saying Swedish values or European values, I think that's a bit neo-colonialist, if you will. I collaborate a lot with Makerere University, and the principal there, Nelson Sewankambu, said famously, "We have values too, and they may be different." So I think ultimately we need to collaborate if we want to be relevant. And for the reasons that you outlined so well in the beginning, we need to collaborate. And that's ultimately about taking risks and managing risks. And risks can be managed. We take risks every day when we cross the street, etc. And we need to build those systems. And it's a likelihood of, well, it's a combination of managing risk. As I spoke to my friend who actually manages risk for a big Swedish company, she said, basically, it's about, we look at the likelihood of the risk and the impact if it happens. And then we make a traffic light system. And that's how we use to guide our company in managing various collaborations. And I can see no reason why academia could not do the same. And truly, if we want to be purist, we have the Nordics, we have New Zealand and Canada. Everything else will be beyond us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then, Tommy C., what do you think? What will be your brief statement to start with?
Well, thank you. This is a very relevant topic, of course, which I've had some experience in working with. So, well, I think you made a good presentation of why we need to have collaboration. Also, Stefan was talking about it. And of course, the reasons are everything from resources, data, to finding interesting people and talent in this very global marketplace today, and of course increase our understanding of what is happening and how we can deal with issues as the global challenges. Now, what we're seeing, of course, is quite a broad diversity today in the science landscape, and it is becoming even more diverse. We're also seeing new emerging countries from countries that we probably did not expect to be high-level advanced science nations maybe just 10, 20 years ago. But we're talking about countries in the Middle East, in Asia, of course, and Latin America. Now, this is something positive, and we need to, of course, continue to collaborate for various reasons, like I just mentioned. But what are the implications? And well, what we're seeing is that the complexity is increasing, and we see that there is this risk, a tendency that there are silos being formed. For example, government versus academia, or various countries against each other, and so forth. So there's quite a complex portfolio of various issues that needs to be managed. Whose responsibility is that? And of course, everyone has a responsibility, but not everyone can deal with all the issues. So the implication here is that what is the work that needs to be done? What needs to be managed? How are we going to handle that? How are we going to organize that? And some of the conflicts sometimes that we encounter, and what I encounter in my work is, what should we be doing and what are people doing, for example? And this also relates to norms. Since the belief systems and the norm systems are kind of expanding in some way, and when we're having countries such as China, which is becoming unequal to Europe and America, the United States, in terms of scientific capacity, of course, there will be additional norms introduced into the system. And of course, that is also creating some kind of conflict. And how do we work with these so that we can have meaningful collaborations rather than more restrictions? So this is my starting point, and thinking about how can we deal with this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And then Stefan Östlund, what is your starting point?
Thanks a lot for being invited to this topic. I think it's a very interesting one, of course. And listen to my colleagues here it's a good starting point, actually. Stefan Swartling talks about the risk, and I'm sure that is a really good standpoint to start with. The difference between the university and a company, especially big, very multinational companies, they are much more centralized in the way that they take decisions and principles. The academia is a very loose group of people that acts differently and with different backgrounds and with a very diverse view on this topic, I would say. So what we need to do in universities or academia is probably to work with risks and to make people aware of what is a risk and how can we handle risks and take away the difficulties in handling risks. Today, we have seen a lot of media exposure to these questions. There have been, especially regarding China and some other countries, and very often I see that people act very much on the media responses, and we have to find ways of getting away from this. And I think an important part here is to educate our faculties, but we have to do it in a way which attracts them and make them better in handling these issues, especially early in their collaborations, because timing is very important. The earlier we can start discussing these problems we might find or that we might meet, the better it is, because the later in the process we can get problems regarding trustfulness and so on. So I'm very interested in what we will come out of this discussion.
Thank you very much. So then if we are looking at it's important to build the knowledge in each researcher, not only in the organization. And then I think I'm thinking about how to build this wise faculty or the organization that in a purposeful and value-based way can make wise assessment before collaborations. Do you have ideas or experience of that? Please, Stefan Swartling Pettersson.
I think obviously we need to educate everyone, and everyone needs to know something, that if you get an invitation to do a genetic analysis of the population in Xinjiang in China, maybe you should think twice. And I think there's a level of knowledge that we need to instill in everyone. But I think there is also a function of the university centrally, actually, to analyze the surroundings over and beyond what any individual researcher can do. And actually, so I'll throw it back to you as a vice rector here, saying that I think you also need to provide that business intelligence and at some level oversight, because maybe I will be very invested in this excellent proposal I have to have 100% compliance with a nice study in Xinjiang. And then I think it's your job to stop me. And so it's a combination of sensitizing, but also setting up the business intelligence to support individuals and at some level also weed out over.
Mm. Yes, I also agree that that is very important. Tomoshi, you have also been working with this area. So what do you think? How can we build this wise faculty and wise organization to be able to consider this in a more systematic way?
Yeah, of course, this is quite a complex question, and to work with this on various levels. I mean, one thing I think is to raise the awareness generally about those issues that we are seeing now with these interfaces being formed, and not only the problems, but also the opportunities and managing the processes. And I think that there's a need to raise the awareness across the board. And of course, then there needs to be some kind of educational function that we're working with to so how does this knowledge then become internalized? And because these are quite complex issues that people sometimes do not, or researchers do not are not really aware of, because I work at a funding organization also, and sometimes we do raise a concern over a certain research project, and probably more often than I would like to, I hear this response that, I mean, we're only doing research, this is objective. Now, of course, you could sample DNA from people, let's say in Europe, we're Swedes and we go to Norway and do that. Maybe that wouldn't be so complicated compared to if we go do that in Xinjiang on the Uyghurs. of course. So people need to be aware of that, and that's an issue of raising awareness. But at the same time, I think also that we also had the discussion about whether we should have lists or not, saying red or green. But one of those issues with that is that it becomes very problematic in the sense that we can't cover everything. And then there's also this complication where people think that, well, we have followed the list, so we're not doing anything wrong. So how do we kind of work with a combination of that, where there needs to be some kind of guidance with documents, but at the same time, we also need to raise common sense. I would call it common sense, basically, like some things you should maybe do, and some things you should refrain from. And what is that? So there's a lot of variation in how people think about that. So and then we could think I need to open up a little more and have this transparency when we're talking about it and raise these issues. And that's not an easy thing. And then we can do it via some kind of documentation. We can do that via education, and then those are things that are ongoing. But making people better, smarter, more responsible, it takes a lot of time. But through education, through raising awareness, and then also providing some support from, well, the support functions play a very important role here, because they can support researchers that do need to have some kind of assistance with respect to how to form the networks, how to deal with funding, how to work with legal matters and so forth. But in the end, I think the most difficult part is actually research, because they are the ones that have the interfaces. They're the ones that will be encountering these issues. And I think that the most important part here is to work with them through education, but also raising awareness among the leadership, because it's very important that the leadership is taking a proactive stance on actually improving these matters.
Stefan Östlund, what do you think? How to build this wise faculty?
Yeah, of course, I agree with both Stefan and Tommy in many ways. Of course, a university needs some kind of intelligence regarding this kind of issues. So we need to have that kind of knowledge and some references to work with, of course. The world is, the collaborations are typically not white or black. They are mostly gray. And of course, someone has to tell us when it's black or red, or someone has to especially that. We don't need to know when it's green, because that's pretty more obvious. But on the other hand, if you try to build too much on intelligence or management in the way that, well, we know the answer, we have the results, we know, we take the decision. Of course, that is something that normally generates a faculty which is, well, they take the decision, I don't think so much about it. And we have to find this compromise of a much more well-educated or trained, I would say, faculty. And of course, it's not putting them into the classroom, it's more like working with cases, discussing and working in retreats or whatever you do, to find this kind of your own compass, so to say, to work with, which makes it simpler for us in the management of a university to also put up our way of handling it. Because what I would really not like to see is some kind of expert decision on all these matters, because that generates a faculty which is less careful in starting discussions or trying to find out, because there's always someone that has to take the decision. That is, it's not the way I would like to see it myself. Yeah,
because also if we are thinking it from the central management point of view, if it's only when researchers are about to sign the contract that the discussion will come, then it's often too late. And there is also a lot of collaborations that are made when you work together without a contract and formal funding and so on. So then it's also more difficult to see it. Yeah, Stefan,
I think it's actually not only the faculty that has to be well educated, actually all the staff has to have some kind of knowledge about these issues, because there's also a tendency sometimes that you see that people working with administration claim, well, that someone take the decision. KDH, it's Annika, what is your opinion? And you're supposed to be the expert, and you're not the well-educated one. You're not the expert on each of these dilemmas or matters you're discussing. So we need actually to build a more faculty and a staff with a little bit of self-confidence that actually can work with this, and that has a culture of taking responsibility in that way. But where we end up is, of course, a process.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Tommy, before we start, it seems like the audio disappeared for the participants. So maybe if I can hear that it's back for the attendees. I hope that will.
We are trying to work on it.
Okay, thank you. Should we wait until it is fixed?
That means we're
okay.
Okay.
There are some that still hear you.
Okay.
Well, then I suggest that we continue.
Okay, so it was just a singular problem. Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. So, Tommy, you wanted to reply to it.
Yes, no, because I was also talking about whose responsibility is this, and of course I was saying that this is a ubiquitous problem, and everyone's responsible, of course. But then there are these certain areas, and we need to have a little more, I think, detailed understanding of what kind of responsibilities are we talking about, and also what kind of opportunities that are going missing here. I mean, we're talking about from the research perspective. I'm talking about academic incentive structures and systems. Sometimes doesn't go very well together with an ethical way of conducting yourself. I mean, I noticed, of course, that there is a lot of opportunities being offered. I've also seen projects where just because you cannot do it here, you will try and do it somewhere else, and that happens maybe a little more often than we would like to, and it is because differences in regulation, in laws, and also those gray areas that Stefan was talking about. There are gray areas that and in this sense, you know, I think that the responsibility falls on the researcher to, and here you have to instill some kind of a norm, value system, what is okay and not, and that is not, it's quite diffuse what that is. And of course, I think we can, the red lines, if we don't kill anyone, or we don't want to have someone hurt, but then, you know, below that red line, there's the gray area is very, very big. Now, how do we manage that? How do we discuss that? And that is a combination of the researcher needs to be more well aware of those issues, to raise the awareness, but also I think that here the intelligence units or sections that we work with that have this role to play to kind of identify what that is, together with the researchers, of course, and here the management also needs to be involved in order to kind of provide a vision for what we're heading, but also what we need to be aware of, what we need to control or not. And here, this is the difficult part, because we have the incentive structures that produce as much as you can, as fast as you can, with novel results, but be responsible. And what I don't really know what that means sometimes.
Yes, please, Stefan.
I think incentive structures are not a given. They can change. They're created by human beings. They can be changed by human beings. And when I was with UNICEF, I found British researchers were extremely helpful to me as a policymaker and leader of a global health section at UNICEF. And I was thanking them profusely for all the kind of help they gave. And they said, no, you don't need to thank me so much. Now I finally know what to write in the evaluation box affecting policy and practice. So I think it's totally within the realm of university leadership to change such incentives, and also insert not just bibliometric production at any cost, but also some of these considerations that we're talking about here. and providing the business intelligence to help us go along, and some oversight mechanism. However, I'd also like to make a distinction here, because I think we are uncomfortable more about governments than we are about universities. And to the extent that universities actually represent civil society, then we are collaborating with civil society and individual researchers. And I think it's very important that we have ethical and moral standards that we uphold in those individual collaborations, and one civil society did the other. But if we come to a point where we think we cannot distinguish the university from government, then I think we have a bigger issue. And that's obviously beyond the individual researcher to figure out what's going on in country X, Y, or Z. And is the government really dictating the Royal Institute of Technology what you can do and not do, and how, etc. And that's where I think business intelligence needs to come in. Thank you.
Mm. Yeah, that also makes the question, should this be for each university that is thinking about this, or is it for the all universities in a country, or is it for all universities in Europe, or what do you think there?
Well, Stephanie, if I can start, I think it's economies of scale. And I mean, many of us are in Stockholm. I mean, why don't the Stockholm University start collaborating? Why don't the Swedish universities start collaborating? I'm a bit hesitant towards sort of this European values discussion that I find emerging. So I would be very careful about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I fully agree with Stefan about values, European values and so on. It's not really simple to talk about values. They are very difficult to handle, and also within the university sometimes.
Yeah, that's right. I also would recommend, if you people that are attendees, if you have any questions to the panelists, you can please put them in the chat, and we will make a selection of the questions to be sent to the panelists also. So then I will continue with this question about dual use or ethical dumping. Is it something that you think it could be influenced or limited? What do you think? Yes, Tommy?
No, definitely, for sure. I do work with a lot of the funding organizations and agencies in Sweden, but also in the Nordic countries. And I think here funding organizations do have a responsibility to, both in the appraisal process, to kind of look more specifically at what is this kind of project, and set some kind of limits. But often what is possible to identify are the ones that are really clearly in that red area. Then there are also these cases where you would say that because we don't really know at the time of the application how this project will evolve. We also don't know how certain research will develop in the future, or how a government can appropriate, or the military can appropriate certain research. I mean, it can be research that we've thought was uncomplicated. So it's very difficult there. But from the research funding perspective, it is possible to at least look at the applications and there set some limits. But because also this has some kind of a guiding role in the future. Some areas can, I mean, some experiences can set a precedent for how to look at others and so forth. So that's one part. The other part we're talking about is I think you also have to work a lot with authorities and the universities. When it comes to ethics, I notice a lot of times these discussions are quite local. We have the ethics approval in Sweden, and I do kind of sense that there is some disconnect there between how it looks like in Sweden and then how we have this discussion on a more multilateral level. I mean, of course, I do see those also, especially in some disciplinary fields, but overall, in general, I don't see as much as I would like to when it comes to how do we handle these issues. It's often I hear, for example, when it comes to ethics, people will say, well, if you cannot do it in Sweden, you don't do it anywhere else. But we still do have a lot of people that are doing it somewhere else. So I kind of would like to see a broader discussion and more inclusive discussion on that.
Yeah, that's really tricky. Stefan Svarting Pettersson.
Yes, I think I spend my days these days discussing COVID vaccines and I think vaccine trials and drug trials. And I think it's quite common that we do them in a high endemic situation in Africa or elsewhere. And then once the vaccine or drug is approved, we take it home to Sweden and we're very happy to have it here and to have it in Europe. And I think that's a different kind of dumping, if you will, where actually we're exposing others to the risk and ourselves to the benefit. And to me, there's a duty to implement your knowledge and making it accessible to those populations. And I don't think it's about restricting the research. It's more about making sure that the actual knowledge and the benefits also will accrue to the population that suffered the risk of this trial in question. Over.
Yes. Stefan Östlund, then, if we have researchers then in AI, for example, that say, oh, we are not allowed to do that and that due to GDPR and so on, could we go to another country to do it? It's quite tricky. How would you reason?
This is, yes, it's a very, very difficult one. I think there is no simple answers to these questions, of course, but we have to train each other to handle these issues because there are cases when you can accept to do something in a special environment, and you have to find reasons why you shouldn't do that sometimes. I like the answers by Stefan and Tommy on this matter as well. It's true that so many different aspects of it, and we might not be able to stop everything, but we can of course make processes that can handle it better than we do today. And the knowledge is so important because like Stefan is saying about the vaccine tests, there are reverse aspects of ethical dumping and as well dual use. So we have to be somewhere skilled to do that. If not every researcher has to have the skill, we need the skill somewhere in our organizations, because we are huge organizations that have to have it.
Yes, please, Tommy C.
Yeah, and I would also like to mention that I think it's very important that the research organizations, universities, kind of take ownership of this issue to manage these concerns, because it's easy that otherwise, I mean, we see in some countries, for example, the United States or Australia, when it comes to research with Chinese actors, is that now we're seeing a different level of governmental involvement. And probably what we don't want is to have authorities kind of developing compliance documents. So here's a tricky question: is like, so how do we kind of take ownership of this question at universities, so that we do kind of want to keep this openness? We want to have open science. We want to work across borders because we see how much it will benefit ourselves, but also the world. But I think we cannot be naive and not also consider some of these challenges. And here is about taking ownership of that, and especially those gray areas that we were talking about earlier, and there are many of them. And then after that is also about how do we educate people about this then, and how they should relate to norms, values, and so forth. I mean, and here we cannot depart from that. There should be some kind of Swedish or Western hegemony where we, set all the kind of good values and the others should just follow, right? But this process there's a lot of friction in this process.
Yes, I know also there is intensive work underway in many places to then develop guidelines for collaborations, and they are more or less extensive and practical, useful. And how do you think that these type of guidelines can best be used? Yes, Stefan, you want to start?
Well, I can start. The discussion we are having here is very obviously makes guidelines difficult. Of course, we need guidelines. We should have some guidelines, but we should really think first of how should we use the guidelines. It's not a matter of defining a lot of guidelines. I think I've seen in Europe, at least elsewhere as well, numbers of extensive guidelines how you should act, page up and page down of guidelines. And that is so difficult to use. You cannot use it because you can look at the guidelines and see, well, many of these questions they ask cannot be answered. Is that a yes or a no then? So the way we use the guidelines is more important than the guidelines themselves, actually. Of course, we need some basic guidelines to work with, but they should be handled professionally and in such a way that we really can get something out of them. But of course, we spend too much time in probably discussing details of the guidelines rather than how we should implement them.
So, Tommy, what do you think about the usefulness of this type of guidelines work?
I mean, I see guidelines as some kind of a point of departure. I mean, they're good to use as a material for discussion. And then there are many guidelines and sometimes they're conflicting. And it's very difficult to use them. And then they might be used differently in various projects and fields and countries and so forth. So there's a lot of variation that can happen there. So it's not about seeing them either as black or white, but they kind of set some kind of a starting point for a discussion. But then what happens then is that, so when a researcher or a university kind of start with a document, it is about being able to interpret that and what that means for your own research project. And I think that's also about capacity building. That's also what I was talking about, common sense sometimes. Just knowing more about the world. It is. I don't think. I mean, is it too much to ask to be a little more knowledgeable about the world? I don't think so. So this is a responsibility that people need to work with and on and become more competent there. And then these documents then will be more useful if there is a baseline of understanding of other countries and some of these gray areas. But alone, I don't think they're very useful.
Yes, Stefan Swartling-Pedersen.
I have 4 children and they started kindergarten, they started primary school, and the first day or two and the first week was discussing values and how we relate to each other, etc. And I think that created some kind of base also for self-policing and saying, well, I don't think you shouldn't be doing that, etc. So certainly, I think guidelines and rules can play a formal role, but it needs to be owned and it needs to be a living process and living values. So I think it's something you need as an induction, but you also need to keep alive and discussing what that means. So that's a partial answer to your question.
We also have a lot of international staff or people that are coming and getting employed at the different universities in different times and so on. So that might also add complexity to that type of training and that type of discussion with new people coming in all the time. Yes, Tommy? Yes.
Yeah, and a risk also with these documents is that if there is no kind of added knowledge and competence to use them, the risk is that they will become documents that will just give people a reason to say no. Let's not do this. It's just easier for us to not do it, or it pinpointed this risk. And can we be sure that we will not have this risk in this project? No, of course it might be difficult. So it's sometimes convenient for someone that wants to say no. Others will be a little more uncertain about whether to start this then. So I also see a risk with having these documents if there's no underlying competence in using them.
So what about the leadership in academia in order to be able to lead this discussion? What do you think is important there? Stefan Östlund, would you like to start?
Well, yes, I can give a few thoughts about that. Well, I think what is important, let's compare with the company Stefan was mentioning earlier, that the risk aspects of it. A company very often has a culture, they have a strong glue that keeps them together. People act in the same way. They have a knowledge about the values and the norms very clearly of the company. They use the same kind of templates for the presentations at the university. Sometimes you see a lot of different ones. They have a strong structure. At the university, sometimes we miss this kind of structure. We either rely on a very strong decision aspect, that we have to take decisions on this and decisions on that, and the more decisions you take, the more difficult it will be sometimes, because it will be too complicated to follow all the decisions. So we need to build some kind of trustfulness in the faculty, some culture with the people claiming we are working for the same kind of targets, goals that the university has. It has to be built on culture, because culture will remain, people will change. So it's important that we get this culture growing in the company. And of course, that takes time, but it's valuable in the future. We should know what our university is, and that is very important.
Mm. So you Tommy, what do you think about leadership skills with respect to this?
I think that it is integral for this kind of work, because it is very difficult to manage these things, and then there's a lot of issues to take into consideration. And having from my experience when I'm working with this and with universities, is that of course this could be a bottom-up initiative where we have seminars and workshops and just discussions with researchers, and of course that helps, but in a more limited way. If you want to create this cultural change or new ways of thinking or changed ways of thinking about this, then it's necessary that the management, university leadership is working and supporting this, but leaders also, of course, needs to themselves be aware of these issues, and also themselves be updated and knowledgeable. And I guess that's kind of sometimes also one of those, I think, for me, when it comes to internationalization, it's probably one of those most strategic terms and words used, but the least unstrategic kind of major term in university management. And no, I'm not pointing fingers at anyone here, but I do tend to kind of see how more knowledge is needed among university leaders, and the support is also needed to be able to have this work being disseminated throughout the university, to be able to create this culture and awareness.
Do you want to add something, Stefan?
Yes, I think we need leaders who are leaders, and they have a vision. And then you need a management to support you in implementing that vision and implementing some of these support functions and saying no, etc. But I think the worst that can happen is if we get leaders who are not leaders, who don't have a vision, who are managers, and who are not ready to take any risk, because it actually means we will achieve nothing. No guts, no glory, no risk, no learning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really one side of it. What about the other, when we have researchers saying that I have my academic freedom, I can do whatever I like?
Well, I think that's where, again, you need to have a management that signals to you some of these issues. And then at some stage, you need to be able to come in and stop me and say, Stefan, we hear you have an academic freedom, but it violates ABC, and therefore I'm going to stop this. And you'll have to be ready to be unpopular.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking it. I heard this analogy where it's so just because you have a driver's license doesn't mean you can drive in any way you want. There's still rules and conditions for how you can use that driver's license. And I think here we just need at universities and university leaders, but also support functions and researchers themselves. I think the collegial networks are very important here. Also needs to set some kind of framework conditions for how to work with internationalization. So even if there is academic freedom, there are also other responsible practices in how you can use that freedom. And here it is necessary to understand that, well, just because you have academic freedom doesn't mean you can do anything.
Yeah. And then if we continue with you, yeah, Stefan, please.
Yes, well, I really want to stress what Stefan was saying about leadership and management. I think building trust for this kind of rules and behavior we have to have is much simpler when you have a leadership relying on the vision and an idea which we can all join forces for. If you have a management that takes decision and not explaining the visions and the ideas behind it and the direction, then it's much more, well, we have to be more careful, because then you can have ideas that grow in the faculty which are, well, they take decisions, but I act my way anyway. So based on the academic freedom, which of course is nothing we want to have in reality.
Okay, then Tomishi, you're working there with geopolitical collaborations, and how now we have been talking quite a lot of European and the Swedish context. How do you see it in international? Are there similar type of discussions going on all around?
Different types of discussions I'm seeing. I've followed how these discussions are going in Europe, in the Nordic countries, but I'm also hearing discussions in Asia and some input also from the United States. And it's very different, and it's also very different how the Nordic countries act on these issues. But overall, I would say probably that in the Nordic countries, I think we're trying to have a more balanced view on this. Like I mentioned earlier, I think that in the United States and in Australia, for example, where they also have a lot more research collaborations, for example, with Chinese actors, research actors, is that there is and of course there are other reasons behind why they're having such strong responses, but there I see there's now less room for collaboration, while in Europe I think that we are still kind of thinking about whether or not or how we can have them, but at the same time, be responsible and also think about what the EU Commission said, strategic autonomy. And also having a part of this strategic autonomy is also to be open, to be able to have these talented people coming over and then also being able to work, but rather than restricting, which I see a lot in other countries outside of Europe and in the United States and Australia, but also some in other places in Asia. I think that we definitely need to think more about what is a good way of managing this very complex portfolio of matters to handle.
Thank you very much. Yes, Stefan, Svarting Pettersson?
I work very much with researchers at Makerere University in Uganda. And the government there has not been necessarily very democratic in the last election and so on. And to some extent, you can argue that civil society is shrinking. So I've been asking my colleagues and collaborators and friends there, how do you think we should be acting from Sweden, from Europe, etc.? And they say, well, you must remember that academia is also civil society, and it's a place where you can harbor ideas and where you can sort of ride out some of these difficult times so that you're actually prepared to come back when the opportunity opens. So I think it's not just about us, it's also about the recipients and or rather the collaborators in their particular situation. And to some of them, I think the international collaboration is their lifeblood. And obviously it's up to us to actually, and maybe it's also their security in some way. You can afford to be vocal if you are a researcher / activist in a repressive country, because you're well known in international circles and because you have collaborations, etc. While if you were purely a domestic figure, you could be silenced. So I think there's that side to it too. It's not uniquely for us who have the better values, as it were, to make these decisions. It's also about the bigger good, and then how to call that is obviously there's no straight and easy answer. Over.
Yeah, I agree on that. And also from your role in UNICEF, did you have these type of discussions there too?
UNICEF works always with governments around the world. So it's an international and multinational organization with government as counterpart. So yes, it's different in humanitarian settings. And yes, we try to access all sorts of populations. But I think universities are in a freer position because we are engaging researcher to researcher and university to university, and not necessarily with the national government. So I think universities should realize that it's not just a paper production facility, but that it is civil society, and uphold values and ideas and instill that.
Mm-hmm. But it could also be university to the countries, that the management of the countries directly that would do research. And then it's also this dilemma about making large impact. If we would do that, we could make a large impact, but at the same time,
certainly,
we could help a regime that we might not have the same values as.
Yes, again, I would caution against a particular set of values, because if we think so democratic values, for instance, as we alluded to from the Economist Index, we have about 100 million people to collaborate with, and if we refrain from collaborating with the other 7.6 billion in the world, I think we missed it. I think that producing knowledge and leaving it in a paper somewhere, even if it's high impact, is not enough. Because if we actually appreciate the urgency of the existential challenges humanity face now and the short time frame we have to address them with climate tipping points, etc., I think we have a duty to implement knowledge. And that implies working with other actors, private sector, government, civil society, beyond universities, etc., that we maybe not necessarily used to working with, that we maybe not necessarily incentivized at present to be working with. And I think we need to align those things. And then obviously calling it out, saying that if we actually contributing to something that might turn out to be bad and violate one of our principles, that's where I think we need help. We need an ongoing discussion. We need some kind of intelligence system. And ultimately, we need people like you to call me out and say, Stefan, we realize your good intentions, but etc. etc.
Yes, Tommy, you had a point. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I would like to kind of echo those ideas, but also I'm thinking about. I mean, there's this. I think in more popular view of science as diplomacy, and I think that although it can have kind of like an empty tone, I think it's very important. I mean, I'm working in the funding world and part-time also, and one of the things that we're trying to discuss a little more is not only focusing when we're in the appraisal process, when we're looking at applications, it's not only about, so what will you get out of this in terms of publications or novel data and those kind of things that will satisfy the academic system and also career development, but also thinking about what about relationship building, what about reciprocity. Those are very important things to consider, which I think that has always been secondary to what are the publications coming out of this, or have you published before. I think we also funders needs to be better at encouraging researchers to write about how they see what are some of the institutional impact of these collaborations. So not only that, what will I get out of it in terms of publications and possible future career development. Of course, that's an important part, and those are good incentives, of course, for people to start these collaborations, but a little broader view. And then on top of that, we also need to be able to manage those challenges that will arise from these broader interfaces that we're seeing over disciplines, over countries, broader set of countries also. And I think that being able to have a broader picture would enable us to have more meaningful relationships and see how they can be developed also with the help more from an institutional perspective. Many times, these tends to just become between researchers.
Yeah, there is also this cultural thing that also if you have not had these type of collaborations before and you start to collaborate with someone that you have not been working with, there are also difficulties that might come up in the research, also due to that you have different ways of doing the research or dealing with it and so on. So that is also an extra difficulty that is added to it. Stefan Östlund?
Well, I hope, it's my belief that most collaborations are based on trust in many ways. We trust the partners we work with in the specific area we work with them. And this trustworthy aspect is so important, I would say. Right now, we have been under pressure for some time. And people claim that when you have too much trust, you are almost naive. And I think it's important that we try to, well, the knowledge we are requiring, the knowledge we're discussing is actually to be able to maintain this trustfulness, or the trustworthy aspect of working with other people. Sometimes we don't necessarily like them in all aspects of it, but we trust each other in the collaboration we do. And I think that is so important. That will generate something which is good. And we have to be brave to really to actually support and protect criticism on this trustfulness or trustworthy aspect of research as well.
Yes, Tommy, please.
No, I just want to say about trust also, and we can also see trust is integral to relationship building and to also in long term gain something more valuable out of a relationship. And I do kind of think that we do see trust mainly being built between researchers, and that is great. And then it depends on what kind of incentives are they driven by. But then there's sometimes this, especially between certain countries, this lack of trust on institutional level, even though there can be trust built between individual researchers and groups. We are lacking sometimes institutional trust, because people and towards the other country, but also towards how our own researchers will behave in such a setting. So here is the importance of, well, promoting trust building, relationship building, that will be beneficial for trust, but also then thinking about what are the institutional trust that needs to be built, and why can't we manage certain things, or why can't we create that those collaborations. I mean, I've seen many times where researcher thinks that this is a great idea, we should do it, and then on mid-level or at the university management level will say, well, no, we don't think it's a good idea. And what happens is then that, I mean, they can still collaborate. Of course, there's this freedom to do that, but they kind of tend to end up a little more in the background. And we at the management level don't really know what they're doing sometimes. And there are reasonable and responsible researchers which will manage them fine, not a problem. But then there will be some that might use that as an advantage, that there's no overview, oversight of these collaborations, and that kind of pushes borders. So the trust needs to be built on this individual level, but also on the institutional level. And there we do see discrepancy there today.
Absolutely. May I comment? Absolutely. You have to build on institutional level. And that's why you have to be a little bit braver, I would say, because on the faculty or the research levels, it's obvious. But sometimes I think universities have to be a little bit more brave in protecting this trust for the relations they have. And of course, the researchers, they are the fundamental part of this trust. But that requires also what we're discussing now for an hour. It requires knowledge, it requires education, it requires well-informed and a little bit of intelligence as well to be brave enough to be brave.
But I think if I can turn it back to you, our moderator here, I mean, you facilitate different kind of work every day that go beyond individual researchers, be it through buying a freezer or a lab or a biobank or a big computer server or something. I think it's also about universities taking a stance and actually making it easy to collaborate with good partners that you think satisfy many of these conditions, and making it easy for me as an individual researcher, because there is already investment in research infrastructure or financial management collaboration with partner X or something. I don't think it means that we need to necessarily chase each and every researcher unless they are doing gross ethical violations, but you can also put out milk for the researchers to gather around in certain collaborations. And I would be, in conclusion, very worried if we actually emphasize nation states and nation boundaries as boundaries for research now in an era where humanity faces existential threats of global nature. Then I think we're not going to solve these issues behind nation state borders. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much. I have not seen questions from the audience, so I would like to conclude this panel session that we have had. So we have been discussing a lot of several aspects related to this dilemma, as I then call it, then from academia, in order to thinking about what is responsible internationalization and how can we work with it. And when we're looking to the path forward, I see that guidelines are very valuable to have as a initial standpoint, but it's not enough, that we really need to discuss them. And it's when we are using that and having this, that openness when it will really make a change. And that is both then from the academic management perspective, from the leadership point of view, that we need to have these aspects in mind, but also from the individual research perspective, because it's the responsibility of the individual researcher to also thinking about which type of collaboration should I involve in. And I should really think about that. Also, this is about building trust, but also what is good collaborators or not. But also about the impact that we can make from the research by collaborating with the really good ones, not depending on where they are, and also where there are good tools for you doing it, but also where we can implement the results and make use of it. So it's from both sides, as you mentioned, when we talked about this dual use or ethical dumping, it's really both ways there. We need to think about how to do that in a more responsible way for it. And also from policy and partnership perspective, to think about that in order to solve the really important questions that we have now for the whole planet that we have, we need to collaborate more and not put restrictions on doing it much less. I think that is one of the conclusions that I can find from what you said here. So I would like to thank the panelists, and of course also all of you that have been attendees and have been listening to us here in this local session on this European Science Policy Forum today. So I would like to thank you all very much and say goodbye and thank you.